The heavy iron latch of the cabin door clicked into place, a sound that felt final against the rising howl of the mountain winter. Outside, the sky had turned the color of a bruised plum, spilling snow in thick wet sheets that threatened to bury the valley before dawn. Thomas leaned his weight against the wood, listening for anything other than the storm, the rhythmic thud of a horse's gallop or the sharp crack of a rifle. But there was only the low, guttural growl of Bear, his German shepherd, who stood stiff-legged by the hearth. In the center of the room, illuminated by the flickering amber glow of the fireplace, stood a woman who looked entirely too fragile for the Wyoming territory. She wore a white prairie dress, the fabric thin and damp at the hem, and her dark hair was pulled back in a neat, practical braid that failed to hide the exhaustion etched into her features. She didn't look like a fugitive, yet the way she clutched her small satchel suggested she was carrying her entire world within it. Thomas watched her, his thumb tracing the worn leather of his gun belt, not out of malice, but out of a deep-seated habit of vigilance. He was a man who lived by the logic of the fence line and the seasons, and having a stranger in his home on Christmas Eve was a variable he hadn't accounted for. "You can sit by the fire," Thomas said, his voice gravelly from days of silence. "The dog won't bite so long as you don't make any sudden moves toward the door. He's a better judge of character than I am, and right now he's just curious." The woman, whose name he had learned was May, didn't move immediately. She scanned the room, her eyes lingering on the heavy beams of the ceiling and the sparse, functional furniture. She wasn't looking for comfort. She was looking for exits. Finally, she took a tentative step toward the warmth, her movements graceful despite the shivering that racked her frame. "I did not mean to bring trouble to your house, Mr. Walker," she whispered, her English careful and precise. Thomas pulled off his hat, shaking the slush from the brim before hanging it on a peg. "Trouble is usually a few steps behind anyone traveling this late in the year," he replied, walking toward the kitchen pump to fill a kettle. "But the snow is deep, and the pass is closed. Whatever you're running from is going to have a hard time finding you in this mess. For tonight, you're just a guest. Nothing more, nothing less." He didn't ask her why a 22-year-old Chinese woman was wandering the high country alone in a wedding dress, and she didn't offer the explanation. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was a heavy, breathing thing, filled with the unspoken weight of her flight and his isolation. Bear eventually let out a long sigh and slumped down onto the rug, his chin resting on his paws as he watched May with soulful amber eyes. It was the first sign of safety, a small ritual of acceptance that allowed the tension in the room to drop by a single, measurable degree. The morning of Christmas Day arrived not with bells, but with the muffled, suffocating stillness of a world buried in white. Thomas was up before the sun, moving through the familiar choreography of his morning task with a practiced, quiet efficiency. He stoked the embers in the stove, the wood catching with a cheerful pop that seemed out of place in the somber atmosphere. He looked over at the small cot he had rigged up near the fire, finding it empty and neatly made. May was already at the table, her hands busy with a needle and thread she must have pulled from her satchel. She was mending a tear in one of his heavy wool blankets, her fingers moving with a steady, rhythmic precision that spoke of years of labor. Bear was sitting at her feet, his head resting on her knee, a betrayal of loyalty that Thomas noted with a faint internal tug of amusement. "You don't owe me any work for the shelter," Thomas said, crossing the room to reach for the coffee pot. He kept his distance, mindful of the way she stiffened whenever he moved too quickly. "A guest is a guest. I don't charge by the stitch." May didn't look up from her work, though her needle paused for a fraction of a second. "It is not a matter of debt, Mr. Walker. It is a matter of being useful. In my experience, a person who is not useful is a person who is easily discarded." The bluntness of her words landed like a stone in the quiet room. Thomas poured 2 mugs of coffee, the steam rising in thick clouds, and set one on the table well within her reach. He saw the way her eyes flickered to the mug, then back to his face, searching for a hidden motive. "Nobody gets discarded here," he said firmly. "The world outside might work on those rules, but this cabin is mine, and I say you sit, you eat, and you stay warm." He watched her take a sip of the coffee, her shoulders finally losing some of their rigid set. The house felt different with her in it. The air was less stagnant, the shadows in the corners less imposing. He spent the next hour cleaning his boots near the door, the rhythmic scrape of the brush providing a backdrop to her sewing. Every so often he would glance at the window, checking the tree line for any movement that wasn't the wind-blown snow. He wasn't sure who was looking for her, men from the mining camps perhaps, or a family she had fled, but he knew the look of someone who expected the door to be kicked in at any moment. "The storm is holding," he remarked, more to break the tension than to provide a weather report. "We'll need to check the roof of the lean-to later. The weight of the snow can snap those old beams if we aren't careful." May nodded, her gaze fixed on the blanket. "I will help. I am stronger than I look, Mr. Walker." Thomas looked at her small, pale hands, and then at the determined set of her jaw. "I don't doubt that for a second," he replied. By midday, the interior of the cabin had reached a state of stable, if cautious, equilibrium. The heat from the stove had chased the frost from the window panes, revealing a landscape of blinding, pristine white. Thomas had spent the last hour showing May where the supplies were kept, explaining the logic of his pantry with the same seriousness he would use to describe a trail map. He watched her handle the jars of preserved peaches and the bags of flour, with a reverence that made him wonder when she had last eaten a full meal. She was a survivor, that much was clear. She moved with a survival logic that mirrored his own, always keeping her back to a wall and her eyes on the light. When Bear nudged her hand with a frayed rope toy, she actually smiled, a brief flickering thing that transformed her face from a mask of tragedy into something vibrant and young. "He likes you," Thomas observed, leaning against the door frame. "He usually doesn't take to strangers that fast. He must smell the lack of malice on you." May stroked the dog's ears, her expression softening. "Animals know when someone is tired," she said quietly. "They do not ask for stories. They only ask for company." Thomas felt a pang of something he couldn't quite name, a mixture of pity and a strange, budding respect. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small silver pocket watch, checking the time. "I have to go out and check the horses in the barn. It's only 50 yards, but the drifts are high. Stay inside, keep the bar across the door. If Bear barks, you go to the loft and stay quiet." He saw the flash of fear in her eyes at the mention of him leaving, even for a moment. "Will you come back?" she asked, the question small and stripped of pride. Thomas paused, his hand on the latch. He looked at her, really looked at her, seeing the way the white fabric of her dress stood out against the dark wood of his home. "I always come back to what's mine to protect," he said, his voice steady and devoid of hesitation. He stepped out into the biting cold, the wind whipping at his coat, but his mind stayed inside the cabin. He worked quickly in the barn, pitching hay and breaking the ice in the water troughs, his movements fueled by a new kind of urgency. He found himself thinking about the empty chair at his table and how easily she had filled it. He thought about the way she looked at him, not with the flirtation he'd seen in town girls, but with the desperate, searching gaze of a person looking for a solid rock in a landslide. When he returned to the cabin, shaking the snow from his shoulders, he found the door barred just as he'd instructed. He knocked twice, a signal they had agreed upon, and heard the heavy timber being slid back. May stood there, her face pale but her eyes bright with relief. "You are back," she said, as if confirming a miracle. "I am," he replied, stepping inside and feeling the warmth of the hearth wrap around him like a physical weight. The evening brought a deeper, more intimate quiet as the sun dipped below the jagged horizon. They sat by the fire, the only light coming from the glowing logs and a single oil lamp on the table. Thomas was cleaning a tack from the barn. the smell of oil and leather filling the air, while May sat opposite him, her hands finely still. The childlike vulnerability she'd shown earlier had been replaced by a somber, reflective mood. She watched the flames for a long time before she spoke, her voice so low it was almost lost to the crackle of the fire. "In my village, they say that a woman is like water," she began, not looking at him. "She must take the shape of the vessel she is poured into. My father poured me into a marriage with a man who saw me only as a piece of property to be traded for a debt. He was a man with a cruel heart and many friends in the camps." Thomas stopped rubbing the leather, his eyes fixed on her. He didn't interrupt. He knew that a story like this only came out when the teller felt the walls were thick enough to hold it. "I ran because I did not want to be water," she continued, her gaze finally meeting his. "I wanted to be the stone. I wanted to be something that does not change just because someone else moves it." Thomas set the tack aside and leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "You picked a hard place to be a stone, May. This country breaks things that don't know how to bend." She shook her head slowly. "I have been broken many times, Mr. Walker, but I am still here. And you are the first person who has looked at me and not asked what I can give them." Thomas felt a heavy pulse of emotion in his chest, a mixture of guilt for his own guarded nature and a sudden, fierce desire to ensure she never had to run again. "I'm not a saint," he said, his voice dropping an octave. "I've spent a lot of years making sure nobody could get close enough to ask me for anything. I liked the silence. I liked the isolation." He looked around the room, at the dog sleeping between them, at the mended blanket, at the woman in the white dress who had turned his fortress into a home in less than 24 hours. "But the silence is starting to feel a lot like loneliness," he admitted. May reached out, her hand hovering over the space between them before she pulled it back, a gesture of restraint that spoke volumes. "Christmas is a time for miracles, they say," she whispered. "Perhaps the miracle is not that I found a place to hide, but that I found a man who understands why I had to." They sat in that shared understanding for a long time, the fire burning down to a deep, pulsing red, while the snow continued to seal them away from a world that neither of them wanted to return to. The following morning, the storm had finally broken, leaving behind a world of brilliant, blinding clarity. The air was sharp enough to sting the lungs, and the sky was a piercing, cloudless blue. Thomas stood by the window, watching the way the light glinted off the drifts, knowing that the thaw would eventually come, and with it, the possibility of discovery. He felt a weight in his gut that had nothing to do with the cold. He turned to find May standing behind him, her satchel packed and slung over her shoulder. She looked ready to face the mountain, though he knew she wouldn't last a mile in that dress. "The path will be clear enough for a horse soon," she said, her voice trembling slightly despite her best efforts at composure. "I should go before the men from the camp find the trail. I have caused you enough risk." Thomas didn't move from the window. He watched Bear sniffing at the door, the dog sensing the change in the house's energy. "Where would you go?" Thomas asked, his back still to her. "To the next town? To the coast? They'll be looking for a woman in a white dress, May. You won't make it to the railhead." She didn't answer, and the silence stretched out, taut and fragile as a wire. Thomas turned around, his expression unreadable, and walked toward her. He stopped just outside her personal space, his presence looming but not threatening. "I've lived in this valley for 10 years, he said, his voice grounded and certain. "I know every ridge, every cave, and every man within 50 miles. Nobody comes onto this land without me knowing, and nobody leaves it unless I say so." May looked up at him, her eyes wide with a mixture of confusion and hope. "What are you saying, Mr. Walker?" Thomas took a breath, the decision crystallizing in his mind with the force of an avalanche. "I'm saying that I'm tired of being the only soul in this house. I'm saying that if you're looking for a vessel that won't break you, you might have found it." He reached out and placed a hand on the satchel, gently easing the strap from her shoulder. It was a slow, deliberate movement, a request for trust that gave her every opportunity to pull away. She didn't. She let the bag slide to the floor with a soft thud. "You want me to stay?" she asked, her voice a mere breath of sound. "I want you to choose to stay," Thomas corrected. "Not because you're running, and not because you're afraid, but because you want to be here. I'm a plain man, May. I don't have much to offer but a roof that doesn't leak and a name that people respect. If you marry me, the law changes. You aren't a runaway bride anymore. You're Mrs. Walker. And I'd like to see any man try to take what belongs to me." The proposal wasn't romantic in the traditional sense. It was a tactical maneuver, a promise of protection, and a confession of need, all rolled into one. May looked at him for a long time, her gaze searching his face for any hint of the cruelty she had known before. She found only the steady, quiet intensity of a man who meant exactly what he said. She took a step forward, closing the distance between them, and placed her hand over his. Her skin was warm, a startling contrast to the winter air. "I choose to stay," she said, the words firm and unmistakable. Thomas nodded, a sharp, decisive movement. He didn't sweep her into his arms. Instead, he simply tightened his grip on her hand, a silent vow of permanence. He walked to the door, slid the heavy bar back, and looked out at the vast white wilderness. The danger was still out there, but for the first time in a decade, he wasn't facing it alone. He whistled for Bear, who came bounding over, wagging his tail as he sensed the shift in the atmosphere. The future was an open loop, a series of questions yet to be answered, but as Thomas looked back at May, who was already moving toward the stove to start the morning fire, he knew that the choice they had made was the only one that mattered. The cabin wasn't just a shelter anymore. It was a beginning. The days following their quiet agreement were marked by a new kind of rhythm, one where the air in the cabin felt lighter, though no less charged. Thomas found himself lingering longer over his morning coffee, watching the way the sunlight caught the stray dark hairs at May's neck as she worked. There was a softness beginning to bloom in the corners of the room, a subtle shift from a survivalist's outpost to a shared home. One afternoon, while the frost still feathered the edges of the glass, Thomas returned from the woods with a bundle of cedar boughs. He didn't say much, but he began to tuck them behind the rafters and over the mantel, the scent of evergreen cutting through the smell of wood smoke. May watched him, her hands paused over a bowl of dough. "It smells like the mountains came inside," she said, a small, genuine curve touching her lips. Thomas paused, a branch in his hand, and looked at her. "It's a bit late for Christmas, but I figured the house deserved a bit of life. And maybe you did too." He walked over to the table, and for the first time he didn't stop at a respectful distance. He stood close enough to feel the heat radiating from her. He reached out, his rough, calloused thumb grazing the back of her hand, which was dusted with white flour. The contact was electric, a silent acknowledgement of the bond they were forging. "I'm not a man of many words, May," he whispered, his voice grounded but thick with a new tenderness. "But I want you to know that you don't have to look over your shoulder when you're under this roof. I'm learning how to be more than just a guard." May didn't pull away. Instead, she turned her hand over, lacing her fingers with his. Her skin was soft, yet her grip was surprisingly strong. "You are more than a guard, Thomas," she replied, using his name for the first time. "You are the first person who has seen me as a person, not a prize or a problem." He felt a steady pulse of heat in his chest, a quiet intensity that made the cold outside seem like a distant memory. He leaned down, his forehead briefly touching hers in a gesture of shared sanctuary, before he turned back to the hearth to stoke the fire, the silence between them now filled with a hopeful, humming warmth. As the week progressed, the physical boundaries between them continued to dissolve in small, measured increments. Thomas began to notice the little things, the way she hummed a low, melodic tune when she thought he wasn't listening, or the way she would carefully fold his shirts with a precision that felt like a silent act of devotion. In return, he found ways to show his care through the language he knew best, action. He spent an entire evening by the lantern light repairing the heel of her delicate boots, making them sturdy enough for the rugged Wyoming terrain. When he handed them back to her, their fingers brushed, and this time the contact lingered. "They'll hold now," he said, his voice a low rumble in the quiet room. "You won't stumble." May took the boots, but her eyes remained on his. "I have not stumbled since I arrived here," she said softly. The intimacy in the room was a palpable thing, a slow-burning fire that didn't need a conflagration to be felt. That night, as the wind rattled the shutters, Bear decided to move his sleeping spot from the hearth to the foot of the bed, a silent endorsement of their union. Thomas lay in the dark, listening to the steady breathing of the woman across the room, and felt a sense of peace that had eluded him for years. It wasn't just the absence of danger, it was the presence of belonging. The next morning he found May standing by the window, looking out at the thawing creek. He walked up behind her, and after a moment of hesitation, he placed his hands on her shoulders. He felt her lean back into him, a deliberate choice of trust that made his heart hammer against his ribs. "The ice is breaking," she remarked, her voice reflective. "The world is changing." Thomas tightened his hold slightly, his chin resting near her temple. "Let it change," he murmured. "We've got everything we need right here." He turned her around to face him, his hands sliding down to her waist. The white fabric of her dress felt like silk beneath his palms. He looked into her dark, searching eyes and saw a reflection of his own earned hope. He didn't kiss her yet, he simply held her, letting the silence and the safety of the cabin do the work that words never could. The arrival of the circuit rider was a quiet affair, a man on a mule who smelled of wet wool and old Bibles, but his presence turned their private promise into a public fact. They stood before the hearth, the very spot where May had first appeared like a ghost in the snow. Thomas wore his best leather vest, and May had cleaned her white dress until it shone like a new leaf. Bear stood as their witness, his tail thumping a slow, rhythmic beat against the floorboard. When Thomas slid a simple silver band onto her finger, a piece he had kept in a lockbox for a lifetime he thought would never happen, his hand was steady, but his eyes were bright with an uncharacteristic shine. "With this," he said, his voice clear and ringing in the small space, "I give you my name, my home, and my life. No one takes you from here. No one." May looked up at him, her face radiant in the firelight. "And I give you my heart, Thomas, not because I have to, but because I have finally found where it belongs." The ceremony was short, devoid of the grandiosity of the world they had both fled, and all the more powerful for its simplicity. After the rider had left and the door was once again barred against the evening chill, the atmosphere in the cabin shifted into something deeply, irrevocably intimate. Thomas took her hands in his, pulling her toward the center of the room. The tension that had defined their first meeting was gone, replaced by a tender, protective heat. "Mrs. Walker," he said, the name tasting sweet on his tongue. May laughed, a sound like clear water over stones, and stepped into his embrace. This time, when he leaned down, there was no hesitation. The kiss was slow, a measured exploration of the trust they had built inch by inch. It tasted of wood smoke and honey and the promise of 1,000 quiet mornings. He swept her up into his arms, the dog following close at their heels, and as he carried her toward the back of the cabin, the shadows of the past finally flickered and died, replaced by the steady, enduring glow of a shared future. Spring began to whisper through the valley, the first shoots of green pushing through the receding snow, mirroring the growth within the cabin walls. Thomas and May moved together now with a synchronized grace, their lives woven together like the threads of the blankets she had mended. They spent their days preparing the garden, Thomas turning the heavy earth while May followed behind, dropping seeds into the dark, fertile soil. The work was hard, but it was theirs. One afternoon, as the sun began to set in a wash of gold and violet, Thomas stopped his work to watch her. She was kneeling in the dirt, her white dress stained at the knees, looking more beautiful to him than the day she had arrived. He walked over and offered her a hand, pulling her up and into his space. "You've got a bit of Wyoming on you," he teased, brushing a smudge of earth from her cheek. May leaned into his touch, her eyes closed. "It is a good weight to carry," she replied. They walked back to the cabin together, Bear trotting ahead of them, chasing the shadows of birds. Inside, the table was set for two, a simple meal of stew and bread that felt like a feast because it was shared. The domesticity of the scene was a quiet triumph over the chaos that had once defined them. As they ate, Thomas reached across the table to take her hand. "I was thinking about the barn," he said, his voice soft. "I think it's time we added another room to the house, for the future." He saw the way her eyes lit up, the unspoken dream of a family finally taking root in her expression. "A room with a big window," she suggested, her voice filled with a quiet, earned joy, "so we can see the mountains every morning." Thomas nodded, his thumb tracing the silver ring on her finger. "Anything you want, May. This place is yours as much as it is mine." The commitment wasn't just in the words, but in the way he looked at her, as if she were the most precious thing the earth had ever yielded. The final night of the season brought a gentle rain, the sound of it pattering against the roof like 1,000 soft heartbeats. Thomas and May sat on the porch, wrapped in a single heavy quilt, watching the lightning flicker over the distant peaks. The danger that had followed her was a ghost now, faded and powerless against the life they had built. Thomas felt the steady rise and fall of her breath against his side, a rhythm that had become the soundtrack to his life. He looked down at her, seeing the peace etched into her features, and felt a profound sense of gratitude. "You saved me, you know," he whispered into the dark. May looked up, her eyes reflecting the dim light of the lantern hanging from the beam. "We saved each other, Thomas. You gave me a place to be a stone, and I gave you a reason to stop being one." He smiled, pulling her closer, the warmth of their bodies creating a private world in the midst of the vast, wild territory. They sat there for a long time, watching the rain wash away the last of the winter's grip, knowing that whatever the next season brought, they would face it together. The rituals of the cabin, the locking of the door, the stoking of the fire, the quiet conversations by the hearth, had become the foundation of a new history. As the last embers of the lamp flickered out, Thomas led her back inside, the click of the latch sounding not like a barrier, but like a seal of permanence. They had chosen this life, inch by inch, and in the quiet intensity of their shared commitment, they had found a freedom that no storm could ever take away. The German shepherd settled onto his rug with a final contented sigh, and the house fell into a deep, restful silence, the silence of a home that was finally, truly whole.